Just whilst we gather, there's just some housekeeping here. First of all, the session is being recorded. So if you're on camera, and you're most welcome to do so, just be aware that that will be recorded, and we'll make this recording available after the session. Please mute your microphones. We will invite Q&A a little bit later, so we're more than welcome to have a dialogue as well. So with that, let me get started and welcome you all here. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our TIDE webinar. The topic today is on the role of culture and leadership as it relates to creating an inclusive organisation. And I'm Colin Sloman, and I'm a member of the TIDE Steering Committee, where I work on the Strategy and Insights team. My day job is the Chief Strategy Officer at Cognition, which is a behavioural activation platform that delivers large-scale change programs, including many DE&I programs. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm a bald, mature white man. I have glasses, and I'm wearing a purple check shirt today. Today, we're going to hear from two very, very interesting speakers, and I'd also like to just ask you a little bit about your current understanding of the topic of inclusion, and you should see a poll up front here. Your names are not recorded, but we'll share the results. So if you'd like to provide an answer to that first poll, we'll gather your opinions. Hopefully you can see that. And here's Dara. So if you would like to submit your answers to the poll, we've got, welcome, Dara. We've just started. So what we're just asking you a little bit about how confident you feel about the topic of inclusion. And as we've got some wonderful experts here today, we'll hopefully improve our understanding. And thank you very much for those responses. So it looks like somewhat confident, 41%, and a bit of in neutral, and a few extremely confident. Thank you very much for sharing that. Okay, so as I said, today we're going to hear from two very interesting speakers. Firstly, Dara Vyas, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of Energy UK. I think we have a slide for you on that. So, Dara, welcome. And would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. Hi, I'm Dara Vyas. I'm Deputy Chief Exec at Energy UK. We are the trade association for the energy industry. We represent companies right across the market, about 85% of power generation and 95% of supply, but also lots and lots of companies, hundreds of companies in that space, in between, really varied, from companies involved in decarbonising heat to EV charging, flex, aggregation, consultants, etc. So I like to think that gives us the USP of being able to work right across the market with all of our members, and it gives us quite a different take on things, as opposed to, for example, a more tech-specific sort of trade association.
Thank you very much, Dara. Our second speaker is Susie Levy. Susie, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, thank you, Colin. So Susie Levy, nice to meet you all. I am someone who's been working in the inclusion space for about 15 years. I run a small consulting firm now, although I did work for a very big consulting firm for almost 20 years, and came actually into diversity probably 10 years into my career, because I found some of the early days and some of the mistakes that were being made a little bit off-putting, which I'll share a little bit later on. I've also spent quite a number of years on government boards, sat on the board of Home Office and Department for Education as a non-executive director. I'm also on the board of the Women's Sport Trust and Foundervine. Today, I'm excited to be here. And for those of you who might have a visual impairment, so you may hear that I have an American accent, although I've been in London for 20 years. I am a middle-aged white woman with brown hair and a big smile.
And wearing hearts today.
I am wearing hearts today. I've gone for happy because it's Thursday, Colin.
Fantastic. So The format of today's session is I'm going to ask Susie to outline some of the key concepts from her recently published book, Mind the Inclusion Gap, and then I'll ask Dara to provide her perspective from the industry boardroom, and then we might talk more generally about the industry and some of the challenges we're facing. And then I hope to get into a discussion on the role of leaders to set a culture of inclusion with all of you, and invite you all to contribute and ask any questions of the panel. And finally, hopefully that will enable us to have a bit of a dialogue. Okay, so let's get into it. Please use the chat, ask any questions, provide any comments, and Kira and Lindsay's going to help us monitor the chat, and just shout if you need, if you want me to stop and pose a question, but I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. So, Susie, let me quote a sentence from the book blurb, if I may. And I'll just hold the book up just to prove that it's really here. So, Mind the Inclusion Gap is your first book, summarizes decades of learning about inclusion and is part of your personal mission to create a more equitable and fairer society by helping others gain the confidence and knowledge they need to take impactful action. Now, that is a big agenda. What motivated you to write the book? Maybe cover a couple of the key concepts for us right now. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I was motivated to write the book because I saw a lot of people who gave a damn but did very little. So I wrote the book with the passive, well-meaning, very nice person in mind. It wasn't easy to write, Colin. And in fact, in my intro, I forgot to say I wrote a book. It's that new. It's that new that it's still landing in my heart that I've done it. It's published just 2 months ago, and the concepts inside, it took me 5 years to wrestle them out of my head and wrestle them out of my heart. The first 5 chapters are really about all of the things you need to know before you go try and take action. And in those chapters, there's a lot of the off-putting stuff. How we feel about history and our pride as a nation, why we need to lean into our history in an honest account, why we need to look at some of the messier aspects outside, things like sexism, racism, homophobia, even men's violence to women and girls. We tend to do a very clinical approach to our workplace inclusion and diversity programs, but actually we're one person. We live in one world. We have one set of experiences. They inform each other. And in my experience, when you are much more holistic and you're willing to talk about everything from domestic abuse to domestic laundry, your inclusion programs go a long way. In addition, the book really looks at 4 key subjects: sex, race, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and the thread that runs through them all. Rather than looking at them individually, which we often do in silos, how do we begin to approach this in a slightly different way? What is the 80% shared that once we understand, we have a good way of gripping and grappling the problem or the challenge in front of us? The first 5 chapters are the complexity. The next 5 are the lessons I learned and the mistakes I made, some very, very humbling, some of which I'm going to share with you today. But really, it offers an opportunity for people to jump in and stop standing on the side of the pitch. Because if we had more people who wanted to make a concerted effort to change our world, it would be moving faster. But unfortunately, and many of you who are inclusion and diversity leads as a part of your day job or side of day job, doing it at midnight on top of what you already do, I've been there. We need collectively as a profession to instigate and support others to have better capability, better confidence, and the skills that are needed to underpin an inclusive workplace and to gain more equitable outcomes. And I don't think we're there yet. So that's why I wrote Mind the Inclusion Gap with its bold ambition, Colin. And I'm quite excited about the ripple it's starting to have in the world.
So some of the key concepts, would you like to share those with us now, and then we can talk.
Then we can roll around in them.
Yes,
can you pull up those concepts in the slides that I put? The first one I'll talk about is my first lesson I ever had, where I, as a very well-meaning nice person, I somehow had thought that out was the moment in time where you decided to tell your mom and dad. You decided to tell your friends, and then suddenly you're like, Mom, Dad, I'm gay, or I'm transgender. But actually, out is not one moment in time. And it took me a while to learn this. Out is every moment in the future. It's every moment that you can be yourself, that you can tell the story of what you got up to on the weekend, that you can share the name of your partner, that you can share the pronoun of your partner. And it requires an assessment of the situation. Am I going to be okay? Is the client going to be okay? Are my colleagues going to be okay? What is the potential negative impact or the potential positive upside if I share a bit about who I am? And this was a huge wow moment for me, because understanding that we live in a world where it's illegal to be gay in 69 countries, you know, punishable by death in 9 of them. I worked for a global firm, and I had never ever considered this. I'd never considered the decision making that my LGBT colleagues were having to do in order to choose to simply tell a story about their weekend or share a small bit about their personal life. And it changed a lot for me, because when I realized it, I kind of had the moment of, what else don't I know? Because if you believe out is every moment in the future, it means you can take action. It means you can do something to make it easier for your colleagues to be themselves. If you believe every out is a moment in the past, it had nothing to do with you. And so it shaped and informed my thinking about what inclusive skills could look like. And I think we need more investment as a community in understanding and then the skills that underpin inclusion. If we go to the next slide, Colin, so my second lesson, which came very quickly thereafter, is that we are all editing. We are all editing, including white men. But some people are editing more than others. And if we take editing or covering or code switching, depending on, you know, in which frame of reference we're talking about it, editing is a choice we make about how much we disclose and what we say, and it takes time and energy. And I have a good friend, Rob, who shared a story with me, who said, Susie, it's not as if I'm hiding that I'm gay, but I can't walk in and be like, hi, I'm gay Rob, because it's too much information too quickly. It would be like me walking in and saying, hi, I'm divorced Susie, and you'd all be like, ooh, that is a little bit too much, too quick. We're not there yet. And so you have this list. Even if you trust the people and you trust the environment, you have a list of who you've disclosed to and who you haven't. And sometimes you don't trust the people and you don't trust the environment because you have seen it hasn't gone well for others. So that sense of editing is holding back situational judgment, a lack of disclosure. And in racial terms, editing can be everything from your hair and the way you wear it, your clothing, if you have English as a second language, or even if you're not from London or home counties, editing is taking your accent and hiding it, sounding a bit more posh and a bit more like the accent that people suggest we should have. So understanding the editing process and the time and energy that goes into it for individuals who are different than the power norm is a really important leadership understanding when it comes to inclusion. And most leaders I know don't understand this. They don't know it yet, but they could. Colin, the next slide for me. I've only got 5 of them. We're 2 through. So trusted relationships and why all this matters. To me, this is the crux of how we fix systemic racism, sexism, ism, which I'm happy to talk about a little bit later on. But if I ask you in the chat box to fill in my statement, what do trusted relationships require, do you think? What are the key factors that human beings need in order to have trust and a relationship together? Would you, in the chat box for me, please, put what you think? What do trusted relationships require? I mean, I can fill this in, but then I'm doing all the hard work. Security, safety, vulnerability, safety, confidentiality, honesty, care, right? So trusted relationships require these things that are very intimate: honesty, respect, caring, confidentiality, vulnerability. Colin, would you build this slide for me, please? In my experience, trusted relationships cannot exist without authenticity and vulnerability, and the communication and the respect and all the things that you guys are putting in that chat box. But the authenticity and vulnerability point is really important, because what happens when one person's coming to the party editing in order to be safe, in order to get on? Can that relationship be truly trusted, truly authentic, truly vulnerable? Is it possible? If you are editing, do you come across as less authentic? I think one of our challenges is we don't look at the volume of behavior change that individuals who are different than the power norm have to do in order to stay safe, keep their head down, don't be pulled out for all sorts of reasons. Keep your head above, keep your head below the parapet. But it challenges authenticity and vulnerability, and relationships are two-sided. And I would argue that the person in the power position is also not being authentic or vulnerable. There is a concept called minimizing contact. It's from the book Racism at Work by Binna Kandola, a fantastic book if you want to read it as an IND practitioner. Minimizing contact means we live in this really diverse world, and possibly with a really diverse, maybe less diverse set of individuals we work with. But by the time we get to our dinner table, it looks like us. Most leaders I meet, when I ask them this question, does your dinner table look like you? The answer is yes, Susie, and I'm kind of ashamed of it and unsure how to fix it. And they'll say to me, does that mean I have to go get a gay friend or a Black friend or an Asian friend or a friend, and the answer is, it means you got more work to do. It absolutely means you have more work to do, because if you're a white individual with a mostly white dinner table, I challenge you to have the same authenticity and vulnerability with individuals of color if you're not having them around in your most trusted space in breaking bread. Colin, next slide, please. Last two lessons from me. I've got many more, but we don't have time for that. Similarly to the minimizing contact is this thing. And it's a thing I used to do. I don't do it anymore, but it's well-meaning and way off at its best, right? So let's give it at its best. If somebody says, I don't see color, and we're going to use it in relationship to race, disability, being gay, it is the same sort of concept. What are they trying to say? What is somebody who says, I don't see color, in their heart, what are they trying to say? They're trying to say, we are all equal. I see you as equal. Do we live in an equal world? Is equality sort of rampant? I mean, we'd be out of a job, by the way. Brilliant, great, take my job away. I'm ready to retire. But I don't see color is a problem, because it doesn't allow you to see the joy and the beauty in color. It doesn't allow you to see the challenge. I would ask you, if you can't see race, can you see racism? I'm not sure you can. You got to admit it's there. If you don't see a woman as a woman, can you see sexism and misogyny, which are everywhere, unfortunately, still in our society? We got a lot of work to do. The book I just mentioned, Tutu, is Racism at Work by Binna Kandola. And my book is Mind the Inclusion Gap, so if that's helpful. So I don't see color is something we have to work with people in our businesses. Leaders need to understand that's the wrong strategy. Lovely, well-meaning, but so far off the mark. We need you to see it, but we don't need you to define someone by it. My friend Sophie says, I am in a wheelchair. People try and pretend I'm not in a wheelchair. I don't need you to define me by the wheelchair, but by God, I need you to see the 3 steps to the bathroom. I am not getting there without your help, without your adjustment, without your understanding that I can't wheel myself down those 3 steps to go pee. It's really, really small thing, but it's huge. So we don't need to define people by their difference, but we need to see it for its wonder, its beauty, its incredible, the things that it brings, and also the challenge and strife that it can bring in the world that is very unequal. My last lesson, and the one that instigated me to write the books, because I meet so many nice people. I meet so many nice people who aren't doing very much. And I think our challenge in this profession is to help people stop conflating being nice and being inclusive. I built a mini little spectrum for people, and I'll just flash it up here if you can see it. And on my screen is a spectrum from activist to racist, or that could be homophobe or sexist. And the thing is, most people I meet are hanging out in the middle. They're relying on their sense of niceness, and they're not doing very much, because the stuff in the middle is passive, and the stuff at the 2 ends is active. And so our challenge is to get more people to stop conflating being a good person, being a nice person, help skill them up, and help get them on the pitch to inclusion, rather than standing on the sidelines going, good luck. I hope you win that match. Colin, that's it for me. I hope that was helpful, a little bit of a smattering of some of my lessons.
Fantastic, and I want to come back to a few of them, particularly the NICE thing, a little bit later. But let's turn to Dara and tell Dara. It'd be great just to hear about your experience of leading on inclusion from the boardroom and your perspectives, and also your personal history as well.
Thanks, Colin. So I suppose it's worth saying from the outset that I do not have any formal training on EDI, and I think that that is probably reflected right across leadership teams in the energy industry. And I don't think that necessarily matters as long as you're open to learning and making progress in this space, and that you're able to listen and hear, and then also crucially take action, because you are the person who has the power to do so. I think, given the audience, you're probably bored of these stats, but I'm going to throw them at you anyway, just for the context of what we're saying. I think somebody is off mute and there is some background noise. I don't know if everybody wants to just double check that they can mute themselves. So there are still 17 companies, according to Powerful Women, 20% of the top 80 in the energy industry who have no women at their board table. Around 3/4 of the energy companies that take part in the Powerful Women survey also have no women in executive roles, which is the people who do the work. Women occupy under a third of leadership roles in energy companies. And what's quite exciting for me is this year they started to collect stats on middle management. Now that's the pipeline, right? That's how we're bringing people up. And that's 32%, so just less than a third of women are in those middle management roles. There's probably lots more we could say about women who end up taking career breaks at that point in their career as well, if they choose to have a family. So, you know, the childcare, shared paternity leave, etc., makes a huge difference, I think, in women's progression to leadership roles. It's also worth pointing out some stats from Pride in Energy. 39% of people who respond to the annual survey of Pride in Energy see viable allies in their company's executive and senior leadership, and around the same number, 40%, see visible LGBTQ+ in their management team, which is great. But 23% say that they don't see any of that, any allies or visible LGBTQ+ people in senior roles at all. It's not necessarily something that's visible. A lot of people keep their lives private, as Susie said, and they may do that because they actually feel comfortable and want to do that, and that's okay as well. But I think it's about the allyship that I'm most interested in, because you want people to be visible allies, and everybody can be that. So those are a few numbers, I think, and that's the context in which we're talking to our industry and our members about leadership. Energy UK is a trade association, and we do take a really active role in trying to increase and champion equity, diversity and inclusion right across the industry. We're actively involved in Tide, working with Colin, and my colleague Juliette's also on this call. I hope you see us really trying to lead from the front on this, but that's not just about us being out there talking to our members, working with Ofgem, the ENA and the Energy Institute. It's also about how we ourselves have had to look in the mirror and think about how we live those values, and what that means and what the journey is that we've been on. So I'll share a little bit about that, because I think it gives you a bit of context on how we do it. You know, cards on the table, we're a trade association. We have quite a niche role and we're not huge, but I don't think size is the issue here when it comes to trying to improve things organisationally, and we've done a lot with arguably more limited resource than some of the very big companies in our membership. So something we're very proud of is we were recently awarded Investors in People Gold. And a lot of people might think that's, well, in fact, our incoming chair did say to us when we were sort of so proud talking about this, doesn't everyone pass Investors in People? Like, isn't it just a bit of a tick box? Well, it's not, because Energy UK did fail a few years ago when we first went for it. And so it's been a real learning journey. And what it's given us is a framework and the tools we needed to challenge ourselves on improving. I'm going to share a quote and I'm going to put it in the chat box as well for everybody. or read it as well. But it's a quote from our latest report. It says, "Your people confirmed a culture which incorporates openness, real support from the leadership team, trust, and a willingness to communicate and involve all people at all levels within the organisation. The above points are recognised as influencing the high levels of commitment and pride in the organisation." It's a journey, and I think there's still a lot more we can do. But what I think is worth sharing is that we take EDI, we take the equity, diversity and inclusion aspects of our work very seriously. It is about enabling people to be themselves in work. It is about creating an inclusive environment that means everyone feels respected. But that's not enough. I don't think for any employer and for any leadership team, creating an environment is not enough. Your systems and your processes have to hold that up. They have to stand up to it. It's not just about having a cuddly workplace with beanbags, right? It's about actually having systems and processes, regularly reviewing them with a view to making sure that they are good for everyone and good for people who aren't yet working with you but might in the future. So talk to you a little bit about what that means for us. We have board level responsibility for EDI. We have with the Energy UK directors and the chair, we have 57% men, 43% women on our board. We have a real commitment to mental health and wellbeing with 6 mental health first aiders, access to employee assistance programs, monthly newsletters on mental health. We use the tools we've got that are the same as everyone else has, but we just use them in a meaningful and intentional way. So we do things like Teams channel chats about tips and advice on how to improve your mental health, not just during Mental Health Week, but throughout the year. Small things that make a big difference, like making sure there's fruit available in the office, things like that. They make they give people a real mental health and well-being boost, and you don't have to wait for Mental Health Week to do something and to hold an event. I think that's the point I'm making with that. Generally, I think, we're all living through this social experiment of life after COVID, how we work and how we use our offices and how we utilise our space. We have hybrid working arrangements, probably very similar to most office-based organisations, with 2 or 3 days in the office and lots of flexible working opportunities. We have very generous leave for maternity, paternity and shared parental leave. And as someone with many men who are expecting their first babies or who've had their first babies in the last year, it's something I'm really proud to have seen and support the team on. But I'm not going to lie, it's really hard, because when you have someone going off for 6 weeks, you don't get cover in the way you do for maternity leave. But it's important that we do these things and we figure out how to flex our capacity and resource to respond to this, because it makes for happier employees who are more committed and take more pride in their organisation. So, the trade-offs are real, and we shouldn't pretend those trade-offs aren't there as leaders. I think also, we've refreshed our company values recently, and there's a lot we've done about things like making adaptations for people who have medical conditions. We have lots of opportunities to share practice from different cultures. We have a very active staff working group. All members have a voice on that if they want to. And then there's some of the basics that we consider basics, but again, we're constantly refreshing around our learning and training, unconscious bias, our recruitment processes, blind recruitment, 2-stage interviews, all of that. I suppose for a lot of people who run this seminar, that just sounds like normal ways of working. I don't think it necessarily is everywhere, because if it was, I think we'd see more than just 30% of women in middle management across our industry. So those are some of the sort of practical things that I think people in positions of leadership in an organisation can and should do over and above their individual take and how they do things. It is about system change and process change as well. Just a few, Colin, you asked me to reflect a little bit on myself and my journey in terms of being a leader in an organisation. I think, so I didn't describe myself for anyone with visual impairments, but I am British Asian. I am of Indian origin, and I am a woman, and I worked in the energy industry for nearly 15 years, and I have often been the only person around the table who is a woman. I have more often than not, I'm still often the only person around the table who is not white. I am also no longer the person who's youngest around a table, but I have also been that person. So, you know, I think there is something around how you change yourself in these spaces, and you do behave differently. And now we're talking to a bunch of people who've elected to sign on to an EDI Tide seminar, right? You don't need me to talk to you about what that means. But the reality is that unless you're able to create space for the type of leader that you want to be and that you want to see, your authenticity does shine through. So I think it's really important to remind yourself of that, no matter what your experience has been in taking on a leadership role. You never stop learning, and EDI is a space where I'm on a continuous learning journey, that's for sure. Only in the last 5 years, I'd say, have I become very aware of what it means to my team to see me in my role, and particularly to the young non-white women who have been in my teams over the last few years, and I've been at Energy UK for 2 years, and how that's seen, but also how I, more importantly, how I can support everyone in the team to lift themselves up and also to be true to themselves, whether those are visible differences or invisible differences. So I think it's about making sure that your skills as a leader are not compromised because you're so busy trying to be something else. That's a good point for me to stop on, Colin.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you, Dara. That's brilliant. Now, one thing that we talked about is just the context of the energy industry and your role in the board. I have a couple of questions, but one was, I know you got to keep your eye on inclusion in the context of a cost of living crisis, perhaps some of the most challenging. You talked about post-COVID. Do you want to just reflect on a little bit about the context that your people and the global, or the UK context right now?
Yeah, of course, Colin, and sorry, we did talk about that when we had a meeting before this, didn't we? So I joined Energy UK in November 21. We have had 30 energy companies go out of business, so 30 energy suppliers, I should be specific. Every time an energy supplier goes out of business, that adds to energy is an essential for life service, and over the last couple of years it's been talked about as a public good in a way it never has before. We're also living through a time of incredible political upheaval. We have seen that very short period of the Liz Truss government has had a really long tail for the energy industry. We have had an enormous kind of impact on investment into the UK and into clean power generation, and not just clean power generations, it's about the R&D and the research, design, development of new technologies that we really do need to not only invest in but really accelerate our work on in order to meet net zero. The last 2 years have been incredibly difficult to operate in for our team at Energy UK, because of the workload has been intense. It's been an incredibly busy period. That's both in terms of the political and media narrative, public opinion, but also because of internal things happening in our workplace. So our chief exec was on maternity leave for a year, and our former deputy chief executive passed away. And I think, you know, weathering the storm of an organisation that's grieving is its own type of challenge. It's a unique challenge. She was very loved across the industry, and supporting your team through that sort of thing whilst also trying to respond to a world in which some of the very niche issues you work on are somehow front page news. Some of the kind of things, like we see things about transmission and connections on the front page of the paper. We've had, you know, quite detailed academic discussions about things like green power pool or balancing electricity and gas costs on the front pages of the newspapers. It's unheard of for our industry, I think, you know. And then there's also really tragic, difficult stories, like, for example, energy suppliers who perhaps, you know, treated their customers with disrespect in relation to prepayment meters, that sort of thing. I think, you know, nobody who works in this industry, whichever bit of the energy industry you work in, I think nobody would disagree that the people in their lives who would never really have understood their jobs or really even got what they did, they have had 2 years of people asking them constantly about why their bill is high, what's going to happen next, should they fix, should they switch. You know, it's become a live issue in the way it never did before. You switch your light on, you have light, you pay your bill, and it is what it is. But prices have been soaring. The war in Ukraine's had a huge issue on our industry. So there's something about operating in chaos. And I think, Colin, what I said to you was, whilst we've had chaos outside of our organisation, what we've really tried to do is to really instill in our team and support them with a view that whilst there's chaos out there and there's a lot of unpredictability, we don't need to feel that within ourselves, within the association and how we work. And that's been a mantra for the leadership team. And I hope it's something that the staff have really kind of responded to well. I think they have. We're really proud of the team, because I think we always deliver and punch above our weight, but I think the last 2 years has tested us in a way that most organisations don't get tested.
If I pick up on that thought, because in the context, and there's probably many boards who are sitting and looking at chaos over the last 2 or 3 years as well. So how do you, as a board director who cares passionately about this topic, how do you keep the right focus on inclusion whilst everything else is going to hell in a handbasket, if I use that phrase? How do you keep that focus?
So I think one of the things I'd say is that communication has been really key for us throughout, being really honest about kind of what path we're going down, what matters and what doesn't matter. Remembering that all of our team are human. We represent energy suppliers who have seen a 200 to 300% increase in calls, and call volumes have been through the roof, because when people can't afford to pay their bills, they are really stressed, and they're looking for some help and support. Now, we don't take those calls, they're not our calls, but there are our members are under an increasing amount of pressure. What we do know that is our team have a lot of experience of that. Many of them come from the industry, but we're also really cognizant and aware of the fact that energy is an essential service. So when there have been headlines about poor treatment of customers and the impact it has, and the kind of often quoted heating versus eating debate, we play a huge role in representing our industry in conversations with the regulator. And there is never, ever going to be any sort of position that we take that isn't that doesn't have a compassionate take on how we support customers. I have a consumer policy background. Our chief exec has a climate change background, and our director of strategic comms has a more technology background, particularly in low carbon power generation and offshore wind. So between us, I think we bring really different skills, and our focus is on people. And what we do is we try and support the team to continue to deliver, whilst also being sympathetic to the impact and effects that various parts of the industry are having on customers, because prices have been high and they've been really unaffordable. So we make time to have those conversations. We make sure that we're sitting together to support one another. We also do make sure we do things like staff days. I think it's that post-COVID social experiment that we're all sort of part of, that we're still trying to find those times to invest in one another and giving different people that platform to talk about how best to support one another. Thank you.
Now, Susie, when you're not writing a book, you're also sitting on boards. And so if I ask you to take that perspective, you're advising boards, you sit on boards. So what advice would you give them about setting, and yourself about setting the right tone for inclusion from that board position?
I think very similar to the question you asked, Dara, around how do you, when you're in the middle of so much other time-consuming things,
Yeah.
Stuff that just has to get done. Chaos. I don't love chaos, but that's a great description of where we are at. And when we're not in chaos, we're still consumed and overwhelmed by the totality of what we need to do, generally speaking, right? As humans, as boards. And I think part of the challenge for people who lead inclusion is making sure that it's not the number one thing on the agenda. It shouldn't be the number one thing on the board agenda, I don't think, but it should never be the last thing, or always the last thing, which means it's not actually on the board agenda. And so the question becomes, how do you elevate it to its rightful place? And in particular, align it with the core purpose of the organization. So I see a lot of inclusion and diversity strategies which are here, and then the organizational strategies here.
Mm-hmm.
And that is recipe for not getting very much done in your inclusion and diversity strategy. Ultimately, we have to know not only why it's relevant to who we are, the purpose we serve in society, how different experiences are happening to different customers that we might have who sit in diverse groups, how we are either exacerbating or minimizing inequality. It depends. We're talking energy sector today, but whether we're in the banking sector or the health sector, knowing how to measure that inequality and ensure the right customer experience is happening, and the potential for new customers too, right? It's not just avoiding the negatives. Sometimes it's growth. Sometimes it's the key to growth. And so I would really, for me personally, making sure it is sitting at board level is having it completely aligned, not just because it's the right thing to do. It is, that's a given, but we have to understand why and where it's commercially relevant, and why it's relevant to the employees we have, the customers we serve, and the communities that we sit in. And if your I&D strategy doesn't yet do that, spend some time shoring it up to the organizational strategy, because it makes it board relevant very, very quickly.
So making it tightly aligned to your business and your talent strategy and everything else that ties. My own experience of that is absolutely was the key for our successes in Saudi Aramco. I want to move a little bit to a topic which I think is highly relevant to this discussion, which is about psychological safety. And something that Cognition we're regularly asked to help with is creating a psychological safe work environment and helping leaders understand how to do that. So maybe starting with you, Susie, again, what do you think is the role of the leadership in creating psychological safe environment, and how does it relate to an inclusive workplace, if that's not too complicated a thought? How does that relate to creating an inclusive workforce?
Well, I think it's very much correlated in terms of allowing people to be and operate and make mistakes, right? If I take the word psychological safety away for a second, I think helping leaders understand that the fastest way to get somewhere is to tell people and command them and allow very little variance in thought and behavior. It's a fast way. But it's not a fast way to innovation. It's a fast way to doing an operational thing that you need to do very quickly. And there's a lot of good research that suggests you can't get to that really amazing operating place as an organization where idea generation, creativity, but also the right sort of challenge to leaders is happening, because you're safe enough to challenge if you have a command and control environment. So that's creating the space for people to not only speak up, but speak out and say, either the behavior or even maybe the thing we're about to go do doesn't feel right, and here's why. And it's not just related to diversity characteristics, quite frankly. I think it's so much wider than that. So I think it's pivotal. I think we have to get beyond the term psychological safety and say what complicated. And also, what does it look like? And even if you can dumb it down a little bit to the ability to challenge, to speak out and have your voice heard and not have repercussions, is one element of that safety spectrum.
I think in if you like, the safety, physical safety environment where I worked in the oil and gas industry was very much related to safe to speak up, and we seem more likely to be able to do that when it's related to physical safety, but not when it's related to that psychological safety word.
And that's not just in the workplace; that's in the world.
in the world, absolutely. I was going to shift a little bit to allyship, because I know you both mentioned allyship, and I know you've spoken a lot about it in the book as well. But Dara, if you look at the question in the text from Ranjit, and think about allyship and unconscious bias, would you reflect on how the role of allyship and unconscious bias? Have you got any thoughts on that, Dara?
Yeah. So on just reflecting on your point about safety at the launch of Powerful Women, one of the things we talked about was how in the energy industry, it's absolutely the right thing that we have a board level rep on health and safety, a board level kind of leader or champion on health and safety, but not on EDI as standard. As standard, health and safety is there at the board. So it's really interesting, I think, that on allyship and unconscious bias. So I think there's the formal systemic stuff around. So we have to have competition training, that's statutory. Every single year you do the competition law training because we're a trade association. We deal with commercially confidential information from our members. Every single meeting we have to put out a competition law reminder at the top of the meeting. And that's absolutely standard practice for us. Amongst the other standard training courses that everyone has to do, we have to look at unconscious bias as well as a standard within recruitment, but also how you're a line manager in the workplace, and also how you operate more generally. So there's that kind of systemic. It poses challenging questions, and you have to really consider unconscious bias. For me, I think it reminds me of how Susie began her talk, because actually it's a little bit like the point about not seeing colour. I think you have to see it and recognise it exists in order to tackle it. And that's how I feel about unconscious bias. You have to see it and accept that we all have our own unconscious bias, whichever direction it goes in. And we always make assumptions about people, and it's about tackling those assumptions and questioning yourself. So there is a role for training, but there's also a role for calling one another out. And I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of in Energy UK. We have our exec leadership team, but we also have a management team below us. And what we do a lot within that group of people is call one another out and challenge one another.
So yes, the idea of safety moments is everywhere in our operational world in the energy industry. Let's have an inclusion moment as well. That sounds like a totally good idea.
Colin,
very good.
I've actually seen that, but more a values moment. And I think it's a really interesting question. Do our behaviors align? And inclusion is usually one of the behaviors. We're looking for inclusive behavior. I think it is worth instigating, whether we're at mid-level or senior level or executive level, a little bit of a question of, did we operate that meeting, in particular big decision point meetings, in a way that was coherent with our values? And if one of them is safe to speak, safe to challenge, often you'll see these mantras. I don't think we have to necessarily say, was it inclusive? You could, but I think it's really important we hold the mirror up before we walk out of the room and say, how well did that go? Because actually the learning happens, and I've seen it done really, really well, actually in government, believe it or not.
Very, very good. And I'm going to just pick up on Ranjit's second question here, and related to measurement, because I think we've talked a little bit about measurement. And I know this is a slightly big statement, but on the face of it, it's possible to measure how diverse an organization is if people are willing to share. But how do we measure inclusivity? What thoughts do you have around measuring inclusivity? What is it that we should be measuring, or what should we be thinking about? And maybe pick up Ranjit's points about targets, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Do you want me to answer that one? Yeah, sure. So I think we should set industry level targets and organization level targets. I mean, if we took away the word diversity and talked about anything that was strategic for us as an organization and said, we're just not going to measure it, though. We're going to give you energy, but we're not going to measure how much you used. And we're actually not going to charge you. We're not going to put any measures in place on what success is or success isn't. You'd be laughed out of most boardrooms if you said, we're going to do this thing, but we're never going to measure it. But when it comes to diversity, we go, oh, reverse discrimination or targets, I'm not sure. So I think we should set targets. And I think diversity representation targets should be across groups clearly, and more than just women. 100% agree with that. I think inclusion targets need to measure the experience and the variance in experience. And I've seen them done really well when you get to your employee engagement survey, some level of understanding of how the world within your workplace is being experienced by different groups. And so if we go back to that safe to challenge question, for example, which sometimes is in as a part of the employee engagement survey, or it might be, you know, I recommend this as a place to work, or, you know, whatever your employee engagement question is, there are some that when you look at them through the lens of diverse groups, they very, very clearly tell you the world is being experienced differently. And some of my better clients have been measuring that for quite some time, and knowing, for example, they had a 22-point gap where women were feeling this world 22% less positively, whatever the question was, than their male counterparts, and that their ethnic minorities, and going a step deeper, their Black colleagues versus their Asian colleagues were experiencing the world this way. So we should absolutely be measuring and looking for major deltas in how inclusive experiences are panning out for different diverse groups, individuals with a disability, etc.
Yeah, thoughts on that, Dara, about measuring inclusivity? Is that something that you've tackled? I'm sure Juliette's got lots of brilliant ideas. Would you have thought about that one?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's a lot happening across the sector when it comes to taking the temperature and measuring diversity. We started when I talked about the stats that are collected on things like, I know it's not the only thing, but women. We talked about pride and energy. I think something you said interesting, Colin, around as long as people are willing to share the information. So just reflecting somewhere else that I worked that isn't Energy UK, there's a huge push on EDI and particularly on race and inclusion. Also, but I thought, but what I found, it's a big organisation, 800 staff, but that the HR, the people team, really struggled to get people to fill it in. They did what they thought was everything that was in their power to keep reminding people to, you know, fill in those boxes on the HR form, on the HR bit, and annual pushes to do it. But they never quite got that kind of the tipping point they needed in terms of having the stats and information. So I wonder if we as leaders do a good enough job of explaining why we need the information and what our plan is to do with it once we have it, right? I think that's the thing. So there's a question there around really fully understanding that, of course, people are entitled to their privacy, but you can only work with and improve on things you know. And numbers really help with that. So there is something there, I think, around making the case for it and what you'll do based on the information.
Underreporting and also just getting people to declare. When I worked in the Middle East, it was very difficult because there was very much negative perception around disability. Even though we knew we had loads of people with a disability, we were unable to get them to self declare. There's an interesting question here from Claire about social injustice. I wonder whether you had anything to say on that topic, Dara? And then we'll probably tackle the next one and wrap things up. But thank you. And any questions, please pop them in the question, but in the chat. But anything to say on that one, Dara?
I think it's a huge question, and I suspect Claire has her own views on it and probably would be able to answer it, or at least give a more informed take than I can. But what I would say is that I think it's a growing concern, and I think it's a political concern as well as one for industry to tackle. And I think that there is a huge space here for government to take the lead. And recent reports about the Prime Minister, you know, considering kind of descaling the amount of money that's set aside for this exact issue, to fund support for countries across the world are really quite worrying. So I think there's something around what's the political angle to the social injustice and the spend we need, and how does industry do more to work with government to prioritise this? It's probably the most sensible answer. Do you want me to have a little look at the next question as well?
Please, and then once you tackle that one, and then I'll ask Susie to do the same, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
On practical steps, I think that there's something around how there are the kind of your normal day-to-day interactions that you have, but there's also the kind of, I'm a bit of a broken record because I do think it's about, if we're talking about individuals as leaders, being your authentic self means tackling your own bias, and it means considering kind of the value you bring to the organisation that you lead, or the team that you lead, and breaking the cycle of editing. I don't think we ever will, because we're human and we're complex, but I think what we can do is make sure people have the tools and the safe space to start to break them down if they choose to. And I think that's the thing with the leadership. It's about making sure the space is there and it's safe for people to tackle it if they want to.
Brilliant. Thoughts on breaking the cycle of editing, Susie?
I think you have to first start with the awareness that people are editing. And I don't think we have the level of awareness of what that editing looks like for groups we're not part of. Mm-hmm. And that is a knowledge we all need to gain, right? And there's a whole volume of work to help cultivate those stories, share those lessons, and then turn them into a level of understanding. And once we have that level of understanding, I think it is possible for an individual to recognize that what they're doing and the way they're operating can change whether or not someone feels they have to edit or not. So in particular, as leaders who set the tone, the more we know, the more we can circumvent and shortcut that decision and make it much easier, much faster. You're right, Dara, it's up to the individual person. It's a personal choice how much we edit. Not everyone will choose to come in the same way, regardless of what group we're in. But our role as leaders is to make that choice swift and comfortable and wonderful by expanding our knowledge, rather than being ignorant to the fact that it's even happening. And I would say a lot of leaders I meet, unfortunately, still sit in that ignorant space. It's not their fault, but we as practitioners will have to help elevate and bring their knowledge forward if we want to change and break that cycle. And I think we can.
Fantastic. I would love to keep this conversation going for another hour or two, because I think we have an enormous amount to discuss, but I'd like to perhaps just wrap up with a big thank you to Dara and to Susie. Ask you to have a look at the poll, and just tell us about your thoughts about where you stand on inclusion after our session today. I would want to thank Kira and Lindsay from Energy UK, Juliet, and all the support we've had from the Energy UK team, because without that we would not be able to get this up and running. And I'd also encourage you to take a look at Susie's book. I found it fascinating, and if you have the time to get hold of it, I would really recommend it. Thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate everybody's inputs, and thank you very much for spending time with us, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Dara. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.